So by default in Beyond Typicals, our cut and fill slopes have a grass texture on the surface, but that's a two-dimensional image that is just sitting there on top of the surface, while our grass sections have that grass texture and 3D grass placed on top. So if I move this up and space out that 3D grass, you can see that same grass texture on the surface of those grass sections. So if you did want to put in 3D grass on a sloped surface, you can do that similar to these grass sections. The first thing you'll notice here is on a grass section, the primary asset is by default one of our 8 3D grass types. We have a few different, including some green and brown options for fescue and centipede and things like that. So what I can do is change this to fescue grass, and then I would also want to add fescue grass as an asset to this fill slope. If you check the primary asset dropdown, by default, the grasses are not available as a selectable asset here. You'll see this fill slope only has a few different barriers. But like all our 3D objects in Beyond Typicals, you can get them to show up in that drop-down list. There's a couple different ways to do that, but if you know the asset that you want, you can go find the asset and then choose the section that you want that asset to be placed on. So I can click the fescue grass option here, and I can go find that fill slope 2. So I can find that exact section name by looking here if it's been renamed, or if it's named something different than what's programmed in here. That original section type is here in parentheses. If you don't see parentheses, then it's the name of the section. So I can go into this list and find the section called fill slope 2 and turn that on, and now that grass will be in that list. I've also got a fill slope 5, so if I want it here, I might toggle that on. Otherwise, you could also, just as a shortcut, find that asset and say, I want this in all the sections. So that, it could be a selectable and placeable asset in a common lane or a shoulder. It's not going to change anything. It's just available in this drop-down list. We just have to start from here so that you don't see a list of 400 different objects in every drop-down list. So we try to tailor those to the sections by default. But now that I've got that fescue grass available in all my sections, I can select this fill slope 2, and now I see fescue grass as an option in that section. Here's one of the reasons why this isn't on our slopes by default, is the 3D grass now needs to be rotated and moved so that it sits on the surface, because it still is kind of a repeating rectangular section that our grasses are 22 feet long by default. So I'm going to move this over, and you can see it's by default on this section got a horizontal offset to the left. I'm going to move this to the right. A 0.5 uniform internal offset is right down the center line. Then I need to add rotation to this. So it's a y-axis rotation to basically get this grass tilted pretty much parallel to the slope on that section. And keep in mind, if I change the slope of this section, I'll need to change the rotation of that grass too, because our slope isn't constant, it's the drop over the width. So this is something you'll want to do after you get all of your slopes and widths set. Then you can add that grass to it. The other thing you'll see is it's kind of hovering up in space because it's got to pick a Z point. So it's picking basically the top point of the center line. So all we need to do here is a vertical offset to move that down to the surface of the grass. And that looks pretty close. It looks like it's pushed back a little bit. So I can move that forward. You might need to choose one of the other directions to get that grass moved forward or backward. And if it's too short, one of the other things you could do is change the X scale of this asset. So it would just make these grass rectangles a little bit longer. They would overlap, but it could stretch it out. So if I unlink the scaling so that I can only adjust the X axis, I can make those rectangles of grass longer. You could also scale left and right with the y-axis, or make them taller or shorter with the z-axis if that's something you want to do. That's a nice feature here, is to unlink the asset scaling so that you can scale that out differently. So let's go ahead and add the grass over here to the fill slope 5. So we're going to move that back to the center line with a 0.5 internal horizontal offset. We will rotate in the y direction and move that down. And then here, so this section is 10 feet wide. Our grass sections by default are 8 feet wide. So this rectangle of grass is 8 by 22. With our grass sections, it will scale left, right automatically, but on these sections it won't. So here I may want to increase the width of that grass by adjusting the y-axis scale. I can move it to the right a little bit. I can move it up a little bit to make it look a little more realistic. And then let's move it forward on this section. And that's pretty close. If you want to get really specific, you can load the 2D front camera, and that might help you set your rotation and scale of these things. So maybe that's a little too wide. I can reduce that scale to 1.2, and we'll move it left a little bit. And then let's increase that Y angle. Let's go 26 degrees, maybe 27. And then we can move it down a little bit with a vertical offset adjustment. And that looks pretty good. So in 3D view, this is what that grass looks like on the slope. So with just a few extra steps in Beyond Typicals, we can get that 3D grass onto our side slopes.